Conversations with the donor states to the United Nations have highlighted the need to quantify the number of problematic suppliers to the United Nations agencies in Syria. In order to quantify the number of problematic suppliers to the UN agencies in Syria, we have investigated the top 100 suppliers of the UN agencies as published on the UN Procurement website. We have relied on data published for the years 2019 and 2020. We have investigated these suppliers' backgrounds and business networks in order to identify their connections to problematic actors and human rights abusers in Syria. We supplemented the investigations with interviews with former UN staff, with business people, and with Syria experts. We used the risk assessment tool published earlier this year by Human Rights Watch and SLDP to identify the risk level of each of the investigated suppliers. We found that the highest two risk levels include 27 suppliers. However, in terms of value, they constitute 46.6% of the total value of UN procurement contracts in Syria in the mentioned 2 years.
This report is the first systemic attempt to examine how human rights abusers in Syria are benefiting from UN funding. We looked at the top 100 suppliers to the United Nations for procurement, and this constitutes 94% of procurement funding in Syria. This report is meant to help the United Nations in its operations in Syria to identify problematic suppliers and those who are affiliated with human rights abusers. We identified 7 main issues in this report. The first issue is human rights abusers benefiting from UN funding. And here we have many examples, one of which is a company called Saqr al-Sahra, co-owned by Fadi Saqr, who is the mastermind behind the Tadamun massacre, receiving funding from the United Nations. The second issue is sanctioned individuals receiving procurement funding from the United Nations. And here we found that around 23% of procurement funding is going to companies owned by sanctioned individuals, be it by the UK or the EU or the United States. We also found that some companies are actually owned by regime fronts. The third issue we found is that there is lack of transparency in the data published by the United Nations. Syria, compared to the top 5 recipients of humanitarian aid through the United Nations, has the lowest level of transparency, measured as the share of suppressed suppliers in UNGM database.
The remaining 3 findings include the UN's reliance on large contracts in Syria, accommodating corruption, and the failure to protect its own staff.
The UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights don't just apply to businesses, but to any other entity that engages in business-related activity, including, for example, international humanitarian organizations that procure goods and services for the purposes of humanitarian aid provision. This means that UN humanitarian agencies should be conducting human rights due diligence. By not doing so, they're effectively financing the individuals and entities that are contributing to the humanitarian crisis that UN humanitarian agencies are there to mitigate.